History books often describe how enslaved Africans were treated inhumanely. Yet they rarely delve into the full extent of the cruelty and dehumanization they faced. These books often gloss over the true horrors experienced by those forced into slavery. Every day during this dark period, white slaveholders, overseers, and others involved in the system devised new and brutal ways to inflict suffering upon enslaved people. Slavery was not just a loss of freedom. It was the beginning of a life filled with relentless pain, degradation, and unimaginable hardship. From brutal physical punishments to psychological torment, the methods used to control and oppress were beyond what most can imagine. There were accounts of enslaved individuals being subjected to extreme physical harm, where punishments like amputation were common tactics used to assert dominance and instill fear. What makes it even more tragic is that much of this brutal history has been omitted or downplayed in many educational resources. The true horrors faced by enslaved Africans during this time have often been hidden from the mainstream narrative. However, through deeper research, we can begin to uncover these disturbing truths, events and practices that were tragically commonplace for enslaved individuals. This video will reveal the darker side of history, shedding light on the severe oppression that many enslaved Africans endured, stories that will challenge what you thought you knew about history. Stay with us as we explore these harsh realities, which will undoubtedly reshape your understanding of slavery. 10. Public burnings. Among the most harrowing and barbaric punishments inflicted upon enslaved Africans was the public burning, an act that shakes us to the very core when we reflect on it today. This was not just a private form of cruelty but a public spectacle meant to serve a terrifying dual purpose: to instill fear among other enslaved people and, shockingly, to provide a grotesque form of entertainment for bystanders. A person accused of wrongdoing, whether real or fabricated, could face a horrifying fate. Tied to a stake or suspended above flames in a ritual that was as gruesome as it was inhumane. These public executions were intended to send a chilling message to all who witnessed them: defiance or disobedience would be met with the most extreme form of punishment. The enslaved were often forced to watch, knowing that any step out of line could result in the same horrific fate. But it wasn't only fellow enslaved people who were subjected to this horror. Plantation owners, overseers, and even townspeople would gather to watch these terrifying spectacles, treating the immense suffering and agony of human beings as some sort of twisted form of amusement. This cruelty extended beyond the flames. It was a psychological weapon, a reminder of the absolute control held over the lives of the enslaved. Such acts of brutality leave an indelible scar on history, reminding us of the depths of inhumanity that were normalized during the era of slavery. By confronting these painful truths, we can begin to better understand the full extent of the suffering endured and the long-lasting impact it has had on generations. Some enslaved individuals, overwhelmed by the suffocating smoke and unbearable heat, would lose consciousness before the fire fully consumed them. For many, however, there was no escape. They endured unimaginable suffering as the flames closed in, their agonized cries echoing through the air until they were silenced forever. This gruesome scene served as a chilling reminder of the depths of cruelty that enslaved Africans faced at the hands of slave owners, and the extent to which those in power could wield their authority with heartless brutality. 9. Smoking alive. During the darkest days of slavery, the cruelty inflicted upon enslaved Africans seemed boundless. Despite the existence of laws that were supposed to offer protection, the harsh reality was that these legal safeguards often existed only in theory. In practice, they were rarely enforced in a society where white supremacy reigned, and slaveholders regularly exploited their power. One particularly horrifying practice that emerged from this climate of impunity was known as smoking them alive. This form of punishment was a reflection of the absolute disregard for human life that many enslavers held. In this torture, enslaved individuals were subjected to smoke-filled enclosures, where they were forced to endure the suffocating fumes. Deprived of fresh air, they would suffer agonizing pain as the smoke attacked their lungs and skin, leading to either death or severe injury. One chilling account comes from William W., a former enslaved individual who survived to share the horrors he witnessed. His testimony, like many others, offers a glimpse into the brutal reality of slavery, where the lives of black men, women, And children were treated as disposable, and cruelty was a daily experience. The practice of smoking alive is one of many dark chapters in the history of slavery. By confronting these painful truths, we come to a fuller understanding of the suffering endured and the inhumanity that was commonplace during this time. 8. The role of appearance in slavery. While many enslaved individuals were forced into backbreaking labor in the fields, those working inside their enslaver's home faced a different set of expectations. These individuals were often held to specific appearance standards, with lighter skin tones and strong communication skills being highly favored. This preference, rooted in deeply entrenched racist ideologies, created a hierarchy even among the enslaved. However, these perceived advantages offered little protection when acts of resistance or conflict arose. In such cases, slaveholders would resort to brutal methods of punishment. When enslaved individuals showed defiance or were involved in conflicts, slaveholders often responded with extreme and barbaric forms of punishment. Mutilation was frequently employed as a means to assert control and to instill fear within the entire enslaved population. These acts of cruelty included cutting off ears, noses, or flesh, and in more extreme cases, amputating limbs or gouging out eyes. Slaveholders would sever hamstrings or castrate both men and women to ensure that enslaved people could not escape or rebel. The victims of these brutal punishments were often left to suffer without any medical attention, which tragically led to many dying from infections, severe blood loss, or other complications. The cruelty did not stop with the initial injury. These acts were designed to dehumanize and destroy both physically and mentally, creating a state of constant fear among enslaved individuals. 7. Whipping. One of the most notorious and gruesome forms of punishment during the era of American slavery was whipping. This method became a nightmarish symbol of the cruelty and oppression that defined the lives of enslaved Africans. Enslaved people were routinely subjected to severe lashings, often for minor perceived infractions or simply to assert dominance and maintain control. The brutal force behind these whippings would leave deep physical and emotional scars, sometimes permanently disfiguring those who were subjected to them. Whipping was not just a means of punishment but a calculated tool of terror, used to break the spirits of enslaved individuals and deter any thought of resistance. The image of the whip and its horrifying consequences became an enduring symbol of the brutality that defined slavery. When we hear about whipping in the context of slavery, it's easy to become desensitized to its horrors. The way people often speak of it, casually or without deep reflection, makes it seem as if it were a common, almost accepted occurrence. But this perception needs to change. Whipping was a brutal and terrifying act, its reality far more horrific than words can easily convey. The crack of the whip as it tore through flesh was not just a sound, it was a moment of profound suffering. It was wielded without mercy by slaveholders and overseers, a tool designed to instill fear, crush any spark of rebellion, and enforce the rigid hierarchies of white supremacy. The lash did more than cause physical agony, it left emotional scars that would last a lifetime. For the enslaved, the whip was a constant reminder of their subjugation, a weapon that reinforced their status as property rather than people. As Harriet Jacobs, an escaped enslaved woman and courageous author, once wrote, "The brutality of whipping was vivid and unforgettable." She recounted one particularly grim incident in which a plantation owner mercilessly lashed an enslaved man. The beating was so severe that when the violence finally ceased, the walls of the room were stained with the man's blood. Such images capture the depth of cruelty that enslaved Africans endured, and they serve as haunting reminders of the atrocities that were not only tolerated but normalized during that time. It's crucial that we confront the full horror of these acts. The suffering caused by whipping and other forms of punishment during slavery must never be downplayed or forgotten. By acknowledging the truth, we can ensure that the pain and resilience of those who endured these horrors are remembered with the respect they deserve. The story of Gordon, known as Whipped Peter. Gordon, an enslaved man infamously known as Whipped Peter, became a powerful symbol of the brutality of slavery. His back, permanently scarred from the worst whippings imaginable, bore the marks of a life filled with unspeakable anguish, marks that he and millions of others endured daily. These scars were not just physical, they were lasting reminders of the dehumanization that enslaved people suffered. However, the cruelty didn't stop with the initial lashings. In some horrifying cases, sadistic slaveholders went to great lengths to intensify their slaves' suffering. Even as wounds from previous beatings began to heal, these enslaved individuals would be brought back, and the whipping would start again, reopening those raw, painful gashes. The torment was further escalated when slaveholders applied substances like red pepper or turpentine to the open wounds, inflicting a level of pain that is difficult to comprehend. One especially disturbing account tells of an owner who went to shocking extremes, grinding a brick into dust, mixing it with lard, and rubbing this vile concoction into the deep, festering wounds of a defenseless enslaved person. Such actions were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of relentless brutality used to maintain control and perpetuate the horrific institution of slavery. 6. Branding. Branding was one of the most horrific and dehumanizing practices inflicted upon enslaved people, involving the use of a heated metal tool to burn a permanent mark into their flesh. This cruel method served as a way for enslavers to assert ownership over their slaves, making it easier to identify them and deter theft or unauthorized sales. The branding of enslaved people was treated as routine, a stark contrast to the discontinuation of branding livestock today due to concerns about the pain and cruelty involved. What was once considered unthinkable for animals was, tragically, deemed acceptable for human beings. Large companies and wealthy individuals often branded their enslaved workers to discourage others from making claims on them. In states like Louisiana, the infamous Cold War law permitted branding as a punishment for enslaved people who attempted to escape, further entrenching the power and control that slaveholders wield. By 1840, New Orleans had become the largest slave market in the country, with hundreds of thousands of enslaved individuals subjected to this barbaric practice. Particularly in the southern states, branding became a common punishment for those who dared to seek freedom. The branding iron often seared a letter or symbol onto the face or body of the enslaved person, leaving a permanent, painful reminder of their subjugation. The act of branding not only inflicted immense physical pain but also served as a lifelong mark of humiliation and oppression. It was a stark reminder to enslaved people and those around them of the power that slaveholders had over their lives, reinforcing the brutal system of slavery that sought to strip away their humanity. Enslaved individuals who were branded bore not only physical scars but also the stigma that came with such a mark. These marks were a visible reminder to slaveholders and overseers that these individuals had resisted or tried to escape. As a result, those with branding scars were often denied opportunities to work in homes or hold more privileged roles, being seen as defiant and thus relegated to harsher, more degrading labor. The act of branding left deep, lasting scars, both physical and emotional, serving as a constant, painful reminder of their status as property and the brutal consequences of seeking freedom. 5. The Hogshead Torture. Moses Roper, a courageous man who managed to escape the horrors of slavery, documented the unspeakable cruelty he witnessed. Among the many horrifying punishments was one that involved a grotesque instrument of torture known as the hogshead, a large barrel lined with nails pointing inward. This horrifying device was used by a particularly callous slaveholder to inflict unimaginable pain on those he enslaved. Roper recounted how enslaved individuals were forced into these barrels, their bodies wedged inside with no escape from the sharp nails digging into their flesh. Once trapped inside, the barrel was sent hurtling down a steep hillside, causing the enslaved person to endure a harrowing descent as the nails continuously tore at their skin. The pain and terror inflicted by this barbaric method were beyond comprehension. Yet it was just another example of the extreme cruelty that slaveholders were willing to employ in their quest for control and dominance. This torture device was not only physically agonizing but also a psychological weapon, meant to break the spirit of those who dared to resist or disobey. It was a brutal reminder of the depths of inhumanity that enslaved people faced daily. All the while, the enslaver and fellow enslaved people were forced to watch, witnessing this grotesque display of suffering, a chilling reminder of the lengths to which slaveholders would go to maintain their control. 4. Suspended over fire. Harriet Jacobs, a courageous woman who endured the horrors of slavery and later penned her experiences in her powerful autobiography, shared a chilling tale of torment. Despite relentless harassment from her enslaver, who ignored even his wife's objections, Harriet bravely resisted exploitation. To escape his advances, she took refuge in a hidden crawlspace within her grandmother's home, where she remained in agonizing isolation for 7 long years. This small, cramped space above her grandmother's ceiling became her sanctuary, though it was far from a comfortable one. It was here that she lay in hiding, unable to stand or move freely, as she waited for the moment she could finally escape to freedom. Eventually, Harriet would make her way to England, where she found her freedom, but her journey was fraught with unbearable hardship. Yet this was not the only nightmare Harriet would encounter. Near her hiding place lived another cruel enslaver, one who subjected the people he enslaved to a particularly brutal form of punishment. This heartless man would suspend a helpless enslaved individual above the ground and then ignite a fire beneath them. The flames would rise dangerously close, leaving the victim in a constant state of terror and agony, as they hovered just above the searing heat. The torture was designed to push the victim to the brink of unbearable pain without causing immediate death, prolonging their suffering for as long as possible. This method of punishment was not only physically excruciating but also deeply psychological, as the enslaved person's torment was made into a spectacle, further dehumanizing them. Harriet's account of these events stands as a stark reminder of the unimaginable cruelty that was commonplace in the system of slavery, a system built on the absolute subjugation and suffering of those who were forced into it. As the flames crackled beneath them, the cruelty did not end with the heat alone. A piece of fatty pork would be suspended above the helpless enslaved person, and as the fat melted in the intense heat, it would drip onto their bare skin. Each drop of scalding fat inflicted unimaginable pain, leaving burning marks that seared their flesh. This horrifying method of torture was designed to prolong suffering, with every agonizing second spent under the heat intensifying the victim's ordeal. The smell of burning flesh, combined with the relentless torment, turned the experience into a nightmarish spectacle of human suffering. 3. Demotion or sale. The horrors of slavery were not limited to physical brutality. Psychological torment was a key tool of oppression as well. Even George Washington, the founding president of the United States, endorsed and practiced these methods of control. While the term demotion might not immediately convey the same level of horror as physical punishments for an enslaved person, it could be a sentence as devastating as any form of physical violence. Enslaved individuals who failed to meet their owners' expectations or were deemed not to work hard enough faced the grim prospect of being demoted. This often meant being stripped of any relatively less arduous or skilled tasks and reassigned to the harshest, most grueling forms of labor. Demotion could also signify being separated from family or loved ones and sold to another enslaver, often to places known for even more brutal conditions. Being sold was not just a form of punishment. It was a powerful psychological weapon. The constant threat of sale loomed over the lives of enslaved people, with the knowledge that they could be torn from their families, their homes, and any small semblance of stability they had managed to hold on to. For many, demotion or sale meant the difference between life and death, as being sent to harsher plantations or crueler owners often resulted in a rapid decline in health and an early death. The mental anguish of this constant uncertainty, never knowing when or if you might be sold or separated from those you loved, was a form of torment in and of itself. The threat of sale or demotion served as a means of control, ensuring that enslaved people lived in perpetual fear of the consequences of not meeting the impossible demands placed upon them. This demotion often meant being stripped of relatively less grueling roles, such as domestic work or skilled trades, and being forced into the brutal reality of field labor, where the physical toll was far greater. For many enslaved people, this change in duties marked a sharp decline in their health and quality of life. 2. Forced reproduction. Among the many horrors endured by enslaved people, forced reproduction ranks among the most harrowing and dehumanizing. Enslaved black women were frequently subjected to harassment, sexual assault, and rape, with no legal protection or recourse to shield them from these atrocities. These heinous acts often resulted in pregnancies, yet enslaved women rarely received medical care or consideration. In fact, they were often treated even more harshly by the wives of their enslavers, who viewed them with jealousy and contempt. Enslaved men were not spared from this cruel exploitation either. They were often coerced into forced sexual relations with multiple women, as their enslavers sought to increase their enslaved population for financial gain. This added yet another layer of suffering and anguish to their already unbearable lives, as they were stripped of their humanity and forced into reproductive servitude. The practice of forced reproduction became even more prevalent after the United States passed a law in 1808 prohibiting the importation of enslaved people. This law led to a shortage of new enslaved individuals, which in turn increased the demand for those who were capable of reproduction. Enslaved people, particularly women, were bought and sold based on their ability to bear children. And many were forced to mate with others to produce more children for their enslavers. These children, born into bondage, would then be raised as property, continuing the cycle of exploitation and suffering. 1. Chained to trees until death. One of the most horrifying punishments inflicted upon enslaved black people was being chained to trees and left to die. When an enslaved person did something that their enslaver despised, whether it was an act of defiance or simply an arbitrary offense, they could be subjected to this cruel and inhumane form of torture. The enslaved person would be taken deep into a forest they had never seen before, far from any source of help or escape. Once there, they were tightly chained to a tree, their movements restricted so that they could not even shift a few inches. No food or water was left for them, as the entire point of this punishment was to ensure a slow, agonizing death by starvation and dehydration. Isolated and helpless, they would remain tied to the tree, suffering for days or even weeks until death finally came. This barbaric method of punishment served as a brutal warning to other enslaved people, reinforcing the total control and cruelty that enslavers exercised over their lives. It was a punishment designed not only to end the life of the victim but to instill fear and hopelessness in all who learned of it. Slaveholders often took pleasure in imagining the slow, agonizing struggle of the enslaved people they condemned to this cruel fate. They envisioned their bodies growing weaker by the day, suffering in isolation, until a slow death finally overtook them. This horrific punishment ended only when the enslaved person died, still chained to the tree. In some rare instances, if the enslaver showed a shred of kindness, they might send others to recover the body. More often, however, the deceased were left to be consumed by wild animals or to decompose where they had perished. Did you know that enslaved people were treated in this way? Is it fair to erase these atrocities from history books? Does hiding these truths spare anyone from the embarrassment or shame of the past? Or does it simply prevent us from confronting the full reality of what happened? We want to hear your thoughts. Please share your opinion in the comments section below. If you'd like us to continue making more videos like this, please support us by subscribing to clicking the bell icon to stay updated. You can also explore more videos on our channel that uncover the hidden truths of history.